Okay, as I have said on a couple different occasions, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there's a huge power vacuum, and the organization that truly steps into this, you have a dispersal of civil power among kings and warlords and people, but the organization that truly steps into the power vacuum is the Catholic Church based in Rome. Okay, it's the official religion of the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century. We've talked about it. 392 AD was when the Church Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and this spreads Christianity throughout the area that was Rome and beyond, because missionaries spread out from the borders of Rome and beyond. By the Middle Ages, so we're talking 500, 600, 99% of Western Europe is Roman Catholic. During the Middle Ages, two distinct Christian churches emerge. You have the Orthodox Church, which emerges in the East, based in Constantinople, along with the Eastern Empire or the Byzantine Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. They will split permanently, which we will get into in the next video, in 1054. The Roman Catholic Church becomes the main stabilizing force in Western Europe. It provides religious leadership as well as secular or worldly leadership, and it plays a key role in reviving and preserving learning. It's also the stabilizing force in Europe. So we're going to talk about all of that in this video, plus a lot more. So at the head of the church is the Pope. The followers of the church believe the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth, and below him, as we've already gone over kind of the hierarchy, you have cardinals, archbishop, bishops, and then the local priests. For the people at the local level, town dwellers, city dwellers, peasants, everyday life is closely tied with the local priest and also with the village or town or neighborhood church. Church's main goal is to serve the spiritual needs of the society, and the priests instruct the peasants and town people in the faith, and they provide comfort in troubled times. The local priest is probably the most influential person in the local area. Teach that all men and women are sinners, but that you can achieve salvation through Christ and eternal life in heaven through the faith in Jesus, good works, participation in the sacraments, and sacred spiritual rituals. To escape punishment of hell, you need to take part in the sacraments of the church, and we'll detail those sacraments a little later. Okay. The church also fills a secular role or a worldly role. It's the largest landholder in Europe, so it has a lot of economic power. It also gets money through the tithe, which is a tax Christians are required to pay that equals 10% of their yearly income. Church has its own set of laws and rules, its own courts of justice. It's called the canon law. They claim authority over the secular rulers, the kings and the queens and the princes and all those guys. Sometimes they don't recognize the church's authority. Other times they do. And there's often a power struggle going on between the Pope down in Rome and the various kings and emperors. This will come to a head about 1,000 years down the road from the end of Rome, during what becomes known as the Reformation, which we will be getting to in the coming weeks. Popes believe that they have authority over the kings, and sometimes they would excommunicate or exclude the king and his people from the church. Okay, if you challenge papal power, he would kick you out. An example is Pope Innocent III excommunicates King John, he of Robin Hood fame, in the 1200s during a dispute about who got to appoint an archbishop. Kind of the larger version of this is what's known as an interdict or interdiction, when the Pope cuts off an entire region. Might just excommunicate the king, or he excommunicates or interdicts against the king's whole country, hoping that the people will rise up and throw the king out. These are very powerful tools because salvation and Christianity are very integral parts of people's lives. Okay, church does a lot of building. They begin to build enormous cathedrals, and these cathedrals get more and more ornate and beautiful as time goes on. The early style is what's known as a Romanesque style. It's dark, it's gloomy, it's got thick walls, small windows, not a lot of light gets in. It's mostly artificial light. This is simply because of what the building techniques of the time allow. But this changes over time as they get better at it. And eventually you start having churches like this one here. This is a Gothic church. I believe this is Notre Dame in Paris. They build what becomes known as the flying buttress, which allows to take the weight of the off the walls, allowing for more windows. They develop stained glass. They use dome ceilings. Technology to complete these churches just become beautiful, ornate structures, much different in the late Middle Ages than in the early Middle Ages. Okay, by the 12th century, the church basically owns 1/3 of Europe. The Pope is referred to as a monarch, the same as the kings. They even control warfare, and they had two important things. You had the peace of God, which didn't allow for any fighting in holy places. So if you were losing badly, you could go into a church and seek sanctuary, and the war would end. And then you had the truce of God, which means you had to stop all fighting on holy days, and there were a lot of holy days. Okay, so it works just fine when it's all Christians, but when you get into fighting other religions during the Crusades, this becomes a problem. A new philosophy develops. It's called scholasticism, and this is the use of reason and logic, the ideas of the Greeks, to defend Christian beliefs. Okay, a lot of the church's life or the church's role comes through the monasteries. Okay, men and women become monks and nuns. They leave worldly society and they devote their lives to God. They enter these monasteries, which are communities of Christian men and women focused on spiritual goals. Three of the major orders are the Benedictines, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. They build monasteries all over Europe and elsewhere, allowing them to become very popular at the local level. They also become the repositories of a lot of the knowledge that is stored, the books and things like that. A lot of the monasteries copy a lot of these books. Okay, the monks and nuns take vows of chastity or purity, obedience to the abbot or the head of their order, and they also take an oath of poverty, even though many of them became very wealthy, especially the abbots of the orders. They also fill a lot of social needs. They tend to the sick, they help the poor, and they educate children. Many of the monks are teachers, and many of these monasteries have whole schools attached to them, and they spread out from there. Some of the new farming techniques that are developed during the Middle Ages developed in monasteries, the most important being the three-field system of crop rotation that we talked about when we were looking at manorialism and feudalism, leaving one field fallow for a year so it could regenerate. Okay, in monasteries and convents, monks and nuns preserve the ancient writings. I've already said this. They taught the Latin and Greek classics, and they often copied many of them. So the monasteries are responsible for preserving much of the knowledge of what's known as the classical area of Greece and Rome. Also, you've seen probably pictures in, well, at least if you've seen the Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail one, the Illumination, these wonderfully illustrated manuscripts of religious works and others. A lot of that takes place in monasteries. Okay. Not all the monks remain and nuns remain in the monasteries. Some become missionaries and they risk their lives to spread the Christian message. Sometimes they're honored as saints. St. Patrick is probably the most famous of these. He brings Christianity to Ireland. St. Augustine is sent as a minister to the Anglos and Saxons in England, brings Christianity there. And many of their followers spread the religion throughout Europe and then beyond when we get into the age of exploration. The church teaches that women are equal in the sight of God. However, they are on earth, they are supposed to be subservient to men or take a second place to it. Okay, a lot of effort is taken to protect women. Church sets minimum ages to marry. However, there's kind of two opposing views of the church. Okay, one end, women are considered weak, easily tempted into sin, and dependent on the guidance of men. Okay, this is kind of the Eve version of it. You know, the Eve was tempted by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. But on the other hand, you have the example of Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, as modest and pure in spirit. So you have these two competing ideas of how women are supposed to be viewed by society. Okay, Jews are still around, and sometimes they're viewed well, but most of the times they're persecuted. Muslim Spain tolerates them for a while. Christians persecute. Okay, the church barred Jews from owning land, practicing many of the occupations, and this kind of stems from the belief that the Jews were the ones who had killed Jesus, so they needed to be punishment. This is the foundations of anti-Semitism, which comes to a head during the time of Nazi Germany, but also in Russia and elsewhere during the late 19th century and early 20th century. Gradually, Christians became blaming Jews for all sorts of misfortune, famines, diseases. The term scapegoat comes from this blaming of the Jews. Jews were often segregated into what are known as ghettos. They were banned from certain territories. Their rights are violated. So in time, they move from Western Europe to Eastern Europe and set up communities that survived until modern times, really a lot of them until the Nazis came and wiped them out. And this is a trend that will continue on well into modern times. Okay. Now, one of the ways that the Jews did serve a purpose, or at least in the eyes of those who discriminated against them, was because of the church prohibition of what's known as usury, or lending money for interest. Jews become moneylenders. Many of them become goldsmiths, which are the earliest bankers, and eventually they move into this because they are allowed, because it's not against their religion to lend money, but in the Roman Church it is. So, intolerance. Church doesn't tolerate a lot of different cultures, Jewish culture most predominantly, but then eventually as the rise of Islam comes into play, which we'll get talking about shortly, all that happens, and you have the whole Crusades and all this and the intolerance of faith. I already mentioned sanctuary, which means if you're in trouble, you could go into the church, and the church could give you sanctuary protection from the authorities as long as you stayed there. Mentioned the 7 sacraments earlier, okay? Church services are part of life from birth to death. It's ingrained into society, as you can see from the order we have here. You had 7 sacraments. You had baptism, which was usually performed around birth. Communion, those of you who are Catholic, you made that probably in 2nd or 3rd grade. Penance around the same time. Confirmation comes more in the middle school. Some of you may be doing it now. Marriage, obviously later. Acceptance of holy orders, joining the priesthood, and then at death, the anointing of the sick. So the church pretty much gets into everybody's lives at all phases. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is quickly, for class, our next class, this will be the Monday after break, what role did the Roman Catholic Church play in European politics during the Middle Ages? Stop and write this, and then pick up. There's one last thing to go through. Okay, just to summarize the medieval church. Everyday life. Christians attend village churches. Some priests run schools in the villages. All Christians paid taxes to the church. Nuns and monks some set up housing, hospitals, schools for the sick and poor. Some become missionaries. Some preserve learning. Power of the church. The Pope leads the Roman Catholic Church. Church has its own laws and courts. The church excommunicates those who do not obey. And finally, reform. The church becomes rich and powerful. Some of the clergy become corrupt. Reformers try to make changes. All of these we'll talk about in some detail as we go along in the course. Finally, there is medieval justice, and this is where we're going to end up. Okay, considered very harsh by today's standards. The Lord judges most of the cases. You had the trial by ordeal. Any of these things, if you could survive them, God protects you, therefore you're innocent. Trial by combat. You win because you're in the right. And then finally, you have the development of trial by jury, which would decide, the jury of your peers would decide whether you were guilty or innocent. So this is the church and a lot of the legal system which stems out of the teachings of the church. The whole idea of God protecting the innocent, protecting the righteous comes out of that. So make sure you've watch this, make sure you've answered the quick right, and we will pick up with this when we return from February break.